Without these gallant warriors, the Germans would have conquered Egypt. The clashes of El-Alamein were one of the most notable clashes of the North African campaign. Many notable international leaders were watching this conflict since it would determine which power would dominate the Suez Canal and Egypt, two of the most significant regions in Africa. Every date has an incredible story behind it, and we aim to bring those stories to you. Hello everyone. Today, in Behind the Date, we'll go in-depth into the battles of El-Alamein. Why is it one of the most important wars in history? Which all fought in these battles? Who won? Find answers to all these questions and more in the video. The Battle of El-Alamein was an iconic battle fought during World War II in Egypt in 1942. It was a critical fight between the German and Italian Axis troops and the British, New Zealand, Indian, and Commonwealth forces. The combat took place in Egypt's western desert, which had developed into a major theater of war during the North African campaign. The conflict lasted over 2 months and involved thousands of combatants. The Germans and Italians were led by the famed Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, while the Allied troops were headed by a number of field marshals, including Bernard Montgomery. The war was conducted in a difficult climate, with temperatures frequently surpassing 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The landscape was a flat, sandy desert with minimal vegetation, making hiding and maneuvering difficult. This war required unwavering determination and had to be decisive. The Allies clearly had a distinct advantage in terms of manpower, tanks, and aircraft, while the Axis had Rommel, who only understood one thing: to win. The First Battle of El-Alamein began on July 1st, 1942, and lasted until July 27th. The fight was fought between British and Commonwealth forces, led by Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, and Axis forces, led by General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, mostly German and Italian forces. It is regarded as one of the most important engagements of the war because it was the first major Allied success against the Axis powers in North Africa and was a watershed moment in the Western Desert Campaign. The fight began with the Axis forces marching quickly towards El-Alamein, a strategically vital town on the Mediterranean Sea. This territory had been defended by British and Commonwealth forces from the commencement of the campaign, but it was now at risk of being overrun. They realized that if the Axis crossed El-Alamein, they would quickly lose Egypt to the Axis. As a result, they had to be far more prepared than their enemies. The British and Commonwealth forces had anticipated the invasion and hence had employed a number of tactics in order to achieve victory. The most important of these were the use of defensive positions, the use of artillery, and the use of air power. The Allies established a defensive line along the Ruwaysat Ridge, which was designed to block the Axis advance. This line was heavily fortified, with barbed wire, minefields, and anti-tank guns. The British also utilized a so-called infiltration strategy, in which they sent small groups of troops into the Axis lines in order to disrupt the enemy's operations. The Allies also made extensive use of artillery, both in the defensive line and in counterattacks on the Axis positions. The British had a considerable advantage in this regard, as they had more artillery pieces than the Axis forces. The British also had access to superior ammunition, which allowed them to fire more effectively and accurately. The Allies also made extensive use of air power, particularly in the form of airstrikes. The Royal Air Force launched a number of heavy bombing raids on the Axis positions, which severely disrupted their operations and demoralized their troops. This allowed the Allies to gain a decisive advantage, as the Axis forces were unable to respond effectively. The Axis forces were stopped effectively near the Suez Canal, and the First War ended in a stalemate. Even though a stalemate, it was still a decisive win for the Allied forces, since they knew the Axis would need months to recover from the combat because reinforcements came infrequently due to logistical issues. This disparity allowed Allied forces to reorganize and fortify their defensive posture, knowing that Rommel would return, and now they would want to make sure he lost this time. The Second Battle of El-Alamein began on October 23, 1942, and continued until November 11, 1942. Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck was removed from command during the first engagement, and his replacement was killed while flying in an airplane. As a result, the renowned Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery joins the party. He flipped the battle and led the Allied forces to a resounding win. How did he do it? Well, Montgomery and the Allies launched a series of strikes on the Axis lines. They successfully broke through the Axis lines on the first day, and the onslaught gained momentum over the next 3 days. Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge on October 28, a huge onslaught that drove the Axis soldiers back to the El-Alamein line. The next 4 days were spent in a fierce battle, with both forces attempting to gain ground. The Allies ultimately broke through the Axis lines and began to advance on November 2nd. The Allies pursued the retreating Axis forces all the way to the Mareth line in Tunisia. The Axis forces ultimately regrouped and established a new defensive line, but they were unable to halt the Allied assault. The Allies pushed on, and by May 1943, they had ousted the Axis forces from North Africa. The battle itself was a hard-fought contest, with severe losses on both sides. The Allies lost more than 13,000 troops, while the Axis forces lost more than 30,000. Despite terrible losses, the Allies were successful, and the victory provided a significant morale boost to the Allied forces. The win was also a significant strategic triumph, ultimately ending the Axis troops' advance in North Africa and paving the stage for an Allied invasion of Italy. The victory was also a tremendous morale booster for the Allied troops, and it was praised around the world. The success at El-Alamein ensured that the Allied troops could move closer to their ultimate aim of defeating the Axis forces and ending WOI. The most renowned battle in North Africa was finally over. And if you enjoy history, we have another fantastic film to suggest about an event that not only ended the world, but also changed it. We're discussing the development of nuclear weapons and the life of their designer, Robert Oppenheimer. Check out our earlier post about it right now.